Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we will be discussing the early barbarian raids into Roman Macedonia. This is going to be a bit of a laid back, late night episode of Samuel's Fortress for the sole reason that it is about 8 p.m. I've been attempting to film this video for the past 8 hours since about noon, and I have encountered nothing but difficulties, technical and otherwise. And frankly, I'm a bit exhausted, so I decided to just pour myself a glass of Vranec, a wine that is unique to Macedonia, and give this one more shot. Hopefully, this will be the the successful attempt. So let's get into it. But before we get into the barbarian raids into Macedonia, I just want to go back and wrap up the topic we were talking about in the last show regarding the Roman administration of Macedonia. So at the end of the previous episode, we discussed how the Romans conquered the Balkans after the death of Alexander the Great through a series of wars called the Macedonian Wars. What I want to get into now is kind of the administration of this Roman province of Macedonia. So when the Romans conquered the Balkans, they established a province called Macedonia, and that province contains not only the historical region of Macedonia, including Aegean, Vardar, Pyrenean Macedonia, but it also includes the regions of Epirus and Thessaly. Epirus is essentially modern-day Albania. Thessaly is the portion of Greece immediately south of Aegean Macedonia. So this is a large province that is referred to as Macedonia, even though it contains regions that are not historically part of Macedonia. However, through subsequent administrative reforms, the Romans redraw their provinces, and through this reform, Epirus becomes its own province, Thessaly becomes its own province, and Macedonia is actually divided between two separate provinces. You have Macedonia Prima in the south and Macedonia Secunda in the north. The reason why Macedonia is divided in this north-south fashion is because that is the dividing line between the Latin culture in the north and the Greek culture in the south. So if you recall previously in the last video, we discussed how Aegean Macedonia and the rest of modern Greece was part of the Hellenic realm, the Hellenic cultural realm, whereas the northern part of Macedonia was occupied by Illyrians, Thracians, Paeonians, Dardanians, various different Balkan tribes who were not Greeks. Now, when the Romans come into the Balkans, they, as mentioned in the previous video, attempt to assimilate or Romanize, Latinize the Balkan peoples. And they're fairly successful in doing this as far as like the Thracians, the Illyrians, the Paeonians are concerned. However, they are not as successful in doing this in the south, in the Greek or Hellenic territories. The reason is that the Greeks are simply their culture is too well grounded, it's too well established. Frankly, it's much more sophisticated, as we mentioned in the previous episode, than the Illyrians and Thracians. The Greeks have sophisticated forms of government and infrastructure. They have they've minted their own currencies. They've established these areas of higher education, such as philosophy and science. They're simply more sophisticated, as I said, than the other Balkan peoples. So the Romans aren't as successful as assimilating them into the Roman Empire as they are these other Balkan peoples. Beyond that, the Romans simply have a great deal of respect for the Greeks. They respect Greek culture, Greek civilization, the accomplishments of the Greeks. So the Latins, the Romans, aren't really too keen on assimilating the Greeks as much as they are the other Balkan peoples. So again, Aegean Macedonia and the rest of modern day Greece, including southern Albania, remains Hellenic, remains Greek, while the northern, everything north of this, becomes much more thoroughly Latinized and Romanized. So that's Roman Macedonia. Now, moving on to the barbarian raids. Early on, you have raids by the Celts or the Celtic tribes. Now, these are not very significant raids. They, again, happen early within Roman Macedonia, but they're not very significant. They don't really leave much of the Celts, that is, they don't leave much of a footprint in the Balkans. And this is kind of a brief incursion on their part. What we see as far as significant barbarian raids into the eastern portions of the Roman Empire, into Macedonia, this starts in the 3rd century AD, and it is done at the hands of the Goths. So the Goths, the Gothic tribes, these are Germanic peoples from north of the Danube. The Danube, you can think of it as the northern boundary of the Roman Empire. There's a ton of various different tribes north of the Danube that the Romans refer to as barbarians. Barbarians simply meaning they're not Romans. So north of the Danube you have Goths, you have Avars, Slavs, just various different tribes that we'll get into later on. But again, what is significant here is that in the 3rd century AD, it is the Goths who come down across the Danube and start raiding the Balkans heavily. The Goths, it should be mentioned, also raid the Black Sea coast, the coastal cities on the Black Sea. The Goths essentially operate as pirates, kind of raiding the coastal territories, but then also start moving inward from the Black Sea coast into the interior of the Balkans, along with the Goths that are moving on foot from north of the Danube. So when these Goths start, raiding the Balkans, they do this primarily along the Roman highways. The Roman highways are the main arteries, the main corridors of troop movement, of trade, of transport and communication throughout the Roman Empire. It all occurs primarily along these highways that the Romans have established. Now, there are, as you can imagine, the majority of the settlements in the Balkans are on these highways. So all the villages, towns, cities, they're all on these highways. So when the Goths move through these Roman highways, they start raiding the Roman towns and villages. And by raiding, what I mean is they are killing the men, raping the women, stealing the valuables, enslaving the remainder of the population, burning these towns and villages to the ground. Pretty brutal behavior on behalf of the Goths. This is pretty much similar to what the Vikings are doing up north. I think most people are familiar with Viking raid, the concept of a Viking raid. What the Goths are doing in the Balkans is not too dissimilar to this. So these Gothic raids again start occurring in the 3rd century and last until the 5th century. So this is not a quick, brief raid like the Celts, for example. These are pretty significant, sustained raids occurring routinely over the course of 200 years. And a good chunk of the Roman population, as you can imagine, is either killed or enslaved over this 2-century period from the 3rd to the 5th century. Now, not everyone is killed or enslaved. A good chunk of the population manages to escape and flees up into the mountains. The mountains during this time are pretty much safe. The Goths do not venture too far outside of these highways, if you can manage to get out of these major Roman corridors, get into the interior, get up into the mountains, you're pretty much safe from these barbarian raids. But the downside of this, again, is the massive depopulation of large portions of the Balkans. So although the major cities, Thessaloniki, Constantinople, obviously, but also the modern cities of Skopje, Sofia, Belgrade, these major cities are fortified enough. They're fortified and have enough of a Roman military presence that they are able to withstand these Gothic raids. However, for everyone else outside of these handful of major cities, again, they're either killed, enslaved, or end up fleeing into the interior. So the Balkans, as a result of these barbarian raids, is significantly depopulated. And again, this lasts until the 5th century AD, at which point the Romans, now centered in Constantinople, with the fall of the Western Empire. If you're more interested in the fall of the Western Empire, I'm sure there's plenty of resources you could look into. This show is not dedicated to the Roman Empire and the Roman history, so I'm not going to really get into why the Western Roman Empire collapses, but nevertheless it does. The Romans lose massive amounts of territories to the west. The empire is now centered in Constantinople, and being centered in the Greek or Hellenic portions of the empire becomes Hellenized and takes on a Greek character. The empire also becomes Christian during this period, during the 4th century, through Constantine the Great, who legalizes Christianity through the Edict of Milan, and then subsequently Christianity becomes the state religion through Theodosius the Great by his decrees. But nevertheless, that's a bit of a sidetrack. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire, which is now concentrated in Constantinople, regroups and starts retaking its lost territories in the Balkans and further west. So again, 5th century, the Romans decide they have to regain control of the Balkans, and their strategy is bribery. They plan on bribing these Gothic tribes to leave the Balkans. Essentially, they give them an offer of a large quantity of gold in exchange for their movement out of the Balkans to the western parts of Europe. The Romans really don't care where they go as long as they leave the Balkans. And this is successful. The Goths take the payoff. They take their large sum of money and they eventually move out of the Balkans. They go further west. The Goths, I believe, eventually set up the Austro-Gothic Empire in modern Italy, but it's not really relevant. What's relevant is they leave. They leave the Balkans, allowing the Roman military to regain control of this region. The first thing the Romans do when they regain control of the Balkans is they establish fortifications on their northern border. The northern border of the Roman Empire, again, is the Danube. So this is where the fortifications are built. Again, this is to prevent further barbarian raids into this newly liberated or re-liberated, however you want to put it, portions of the Roman Empire. But the Balkans is still desolate. It's still depopulated. Regardless of these fortifications to the north, there's not a whole lot of people remaining in the Balkans, in Macedonia. Now, I did mention that a majority of the people who weren't just annihilated did flee to the mountains. However, some people did stay. Not everyone fled. There were people, Romans, Roman peasants, Roman farmers who were there from prior to these Gothic raids, who did not flee, who remained in the area, who persevered, and are still there after the Goths are evacuated, are are essentially bribed to leave, and now these Roman farmers, these Roman peasants find themselves again under Roman rule. The problem is that the Romans, having liberated the Balkans, now wish to liberate the territories that are even further to the west: Italy, Spain, Gaul. Their goal is the goal of the Romans is to regain these lost territories. Now, in order to fund this military campaign into the west, they implement heavy taxation in regards to the Balkan to the Romans living in the Balkans, to these farmers who remained in the Balkans. They are now hit with heavy Roman taxation, and as you can imagine, they're not terribly happy about this. They have just gone through 2 centuries of brutal barbarian raids, only to find themselves now liberated, but under heavy Roman taxation. So they've had it. The taxation by the Romans was the straw that broke the camel's back, and now they too flee up into the mountains to escape this essentially mismanagement by the Romans as far as taxation of their citizenry. And given that these farmers now have fled to the mountains, the tax base of the Romans has collapsed. Their agricultural productivity has collapsed. This leads to a significant economic decline, therefore rendering their military campaign a failure in the West. They simply don't have the men or the money to continue these Western campaigns with the exodus of the Roman farmers into the mountains in the Balkan region. So again, we have one wave of Romans fleeing the population centers into the mountains due to Gothic raids. We have a second wave of Romans fleeing into the mountains due to Roman mismanagement. So at this point in time, we're kind of talking early to mid 6th century. The Balkans is almost essentially depopulated. It's very desolate. There's essentially no one there. And this is, I think, the first nail in the coffin of the modern antiquization theory. As we mentioned in the first video of the channel regarding the introduction to the Macedonian question, there is a theory that the modern Macedonians, the modern Slavic Macedonians, are direct descendants of the ancient Macedonians. We can see here that theory falling apart through this pretty clean demographic break from the ancient period. We can see that the modern people cannot be the descendants of the ancients because here we demonstrate a clear break in the demographics. So whoever the Macedonians were, the ancient Macedonians, whether they were Greeks, whether they were ethnic Macedonians, whether they were Chinese, frankly, it doesn't really matter because they're no longer there. They've either been killed, enslaved, and taken away into Gothic territories, or they have fled up into the mountains. They've abandoned large portions of the region of Macedonia. Again, this is desolate. This region at this period in the early 6th century, and here we see one of the first explanations as to why the antiquization theory is incorrect. It is because here we see the break in continuity between the ancients and the moderns in this late antiquity period with these Gothic raids and the Roman mismanagement. So that's where I'm going to end this video. I will see you next time where we will start discussing the Slavic invasions into the Roman territory and put an end to the antiquization theory and demonstrate conclusively why it is incorrect and why the modern Macedonians are the the modern Macedonians are the descendants of the medieval Slavs. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.